GPS said turn left. She turned left. 300 peonies, one wrong mansion, and one very cold tech billionaire later. She was staying for dinner. Listen, we've all been there. The GPS said turn left at the iron gate, so Maeve turned left at the iron gate. She should have noticed the address was wrong before she loaded 300 white peonies, 200 garden roses, and enough baby's breath to fog a small county into her van. She should have noticed when the navigation took her off the main road and onto a private drive lined with oak trees so old they'd probably watched the Civil War from those exact spots. She definitely should have noticed when the gate, an actual wrought iron gate with stone pillars, swung open automatically as if expecting her. But Maeve Calloway had been awake since 4 in the morning, her hands were still faintly green from conditioning stems, and she'd had exactly 1 cup of coffee, which was approximately 3 cups fewer than she needed to function like a person with a working brain. So she drove through the gate. The man who appeared in the doorway looked like someone had designed him to be difficult. He was tall, not aggressively so, but enough that the doorframe seemed proportional to him in a way it wouldn't be for ordinary people. Dark hair, slightly overlong in the way that suggested he'd forgotten to cut it rather than chosen not to. He was wearing a grey sweater and dark trousers, and the expression of someone who was being interrupted by something important by something deeply unimportant. He looked at Maeve. He looked at the van. Something shifted in his face. Not quite warmth, but a thawing. Barely, like a window defrosting at the very edge. "You're early," he said. Maeve started. "Dinner isn't until 7. He glanced at his watch with the air of a man who checked his watch not to know the time, but to demonstrate that he was aware time existed. "It's 4:30. I think there's been a... Come in then." He turned and walked back inside, leaving the door open behind him in a way that was not an invitation so much as a statement of fact. The door is now open. The decision is yours. Maeve looked at her van. She looked at the open door. She thought about the flowers. She thought about the fact that she couldn't deliver them to the right address in any reasonable time, that the Hargrave Well wedding would be setting up in 2 hours, and her second in command, Priya, wasn't answering her phone, and her business account currently had $412 in it. She walked inside. The interior of Ashford House was not what she expected. She had braced herself for the cold grandeur of old money, stiff furniture, oil portraits with judging eyes, rooms designed for impressing people rather than living in. Instead, it was inhabited. Books stacked on a mahogany side table beside an empty coffee mug, a jacket thrown over the back of a chair that probably cost more than her van. One wall of the sitting room she was led through was entirely glass, overlooking a garden gone artfully wild, and in front of it sat a desk buried with monitors and papers and the architectural ruins of a working mind. "You can wait in the drawing room," the man said, gesturing to a doorway. "I'll tell Mrs. Albrecht you've arrived." "I really do need to explain." "Callum!" A woman appeared at the top of the stairs and descended them with the efficient grace of someone who had spent years managing people considerably more complicated than staircases. She was perhaps 60, with silver hair and the expression of someone perpetually amused by the world's absurdities. "Your sister's other guests aren't due until 7. This young woman has clearly just arrived." "She's a guest," Callum said, in the tone of someone reading from a fact sheet. "Nadia's. She's early." The woman, Mrs. Albrecht, Maeve presumed, looked at Maeve with a gaze that catalogued her in about 4 seconds. Work-roughened hands, green stain at the wrist, hair escaping its braid in approximately 7 places, the slight panic of someone who'd driven to the wrong address and was now standing in a mansion making a series of increasingly poor decisions. "Of course," Mrs. Albrecht said, warmly, and Maeve could not tell if she believed it. She should have corrected him at "you're early." She knew this. She was not a dishonest person. She tipped generously. She returned extra change. She once drove 40 minutes back to a petrol station to pay for a chocolate bar she'd accidentally walked out with at age 17. Deception was not her nature. But there was something about the way Callum had looked at her van, that fractional thaw, and then the words had come in then, and she thought about the flowers and the $412 and the fact that the bride's mother had called her 9 times in the past hour and she hadn't answered. If she could use the kitchen phone or borrow a charger, her mobile had died in the van and she hadn't noticed, just find Priya, deliver the flowers, she'll be out in 20 minutes. That was the plan. The plan lasted until Nadia came downstairs. Nadia was Callum's sister in the same way a tropical bird was related to a hawk. Technically, ornithologically, but experientially puzzling. She was bright-eyed and fast-talking and had the hair of someone who owned 17 products and used them all simultaneously. She burst into the drawing room where Maeve was perching anxiously on the edge of his settee and stopped, hands clasped, delighted. "You must be Declan's girlfriend. Oh, I'm so glad you came early. He said you might be nervous. I told him you'd be fine. We don't bite. Most of us don't bite. Come here, let me look at you. I've heard nothing about you, which means it's serious. Declan never shuts up about people he's not serious about." She's not Declan's date," Callum said from the doorway. He was leaning against the frame with his arms crossed, and I had the disorienting sense that he'd been watching her for a moment before making himself known. Silence. Nadia stared at her brother. Callum looked at the middle distance. Maeve sat in the middle of it all, a stranger at the center of someone else's world, and found she could not say, "Actually, I'm a florist. I've come to the wrong address. Please, can I use your telephone?" She could not do it. She was going to hell for this. In the kitchen, 20 minutes later, Mrs. Albrecht handed her a cup of tea she hadn't asked for and said, without looking up from the stove, "The phone is on the wall beside the pantry." Maeve called Priya. Priya answered on the first ring. "Where are you? The bride's mother has called me 9 times. I went to the wrong address." "Maeve." I know. Can you take the van? I left it at... Actually, I'm going to need you to come get me. But first, you need to take the van to Bellamede Estate. The flowers are all loaded. All you need to do is... Why do you need to come get me? Where are you? Maeve looked around the kitchen, at the stone floors and the copper pots, and the window over the garden where the sky was turning the slow gold of late afternoon. "It's complicated," she said. "Just deliver the flowers first, then call me back on this number." She hung up. Mrs. Albrecht set a plate of shortbread beside the tea, without comment. "Thank you," Maeve said. "He hasn't brought anyone home in 4 years," Mrs. Albrecht said, still not looking up, stirring something that smelled of thyme and white wine. I should explain." "No need," the housekeeper smiled at her saucepan. "Dinner is at 7. And that was that. She found him in the garden. He was standing at the far end near a low stone wall, hands in his pockets, looking out at the hills beyond the property. Up close in the fading evening light, he looked less formidable. Not soft, she doubted he did soft, but still, like a building between weathers. "I have to tell you something," Maeve said, without turning around. "You're not Declan's date," he said. "I'm not anyone's date. I'm a florist. I delivered flowers to the wrong address, and then your housekeeper gave me shortbread, and events escalated." A pause. A very long pause. "I see," Callum said. "I'm sorry. I should have said immediately. This isn't something I do. I'm a very honest person. I have receipts." "You couldn't have answered the door." He had another thought. "Why did you come in?" I opened my mouth. I closed it. "Your front door was open," I said, which was true, but not the whole truth. He turned to look at me then. His eyes were a specific shade of grey that matched the house, which I suspect was intentional, cosmically, if not architecturally. "My sister," he said, "has been trying to set me up for 2 years." I gathered. Tonight's dinner is the 3rd attempt. The previous 2 were... Search for a word. Documented failures. Right. You're not required to stay. She should go. Priya is handling the flowers. Her van is in the drive. This entire misunderstanding could be folded up, apologized for, and left here on this hillside. What would happen, Maeve said slowly, if I did stay? He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his face that wasn't quite an expression, more like the shadow of one. Nadia would stop trying to fix me, he said, for a while. And in exchange? In exchange, Callum said carefully, as if each word was a step on uncertain ice, your business has a new corporate account. My company sends flowers to approximately 40 clients per quarter. The hills were going amber in the last light. The dinner was at 7. She stayed. Dinner was served at precisely 7 o'clock because Mrs. Albrecht was the kind of woman for whom precisely was not a preference but a philosophy. The dining room was warm in a way the rest of the house wasn't quite. Candlelight doing the architectural work that daylight left unfinished, softening the stone walls, making the long table feel inhabited rather than formal. Nadia had arranged the seating with the cheerful ruthlessness of someone who had been planning this moment for considerably longer than she would admit. Maeve found herself placed directly across from Callum, which meant she spent the first 20 minutes of dinner learning his face in the specific, unavoidable way you learn the face of someone you cannot stop looking at without making it obvious that you were looking. He was watching her too. She caught it twice. Both times, he looked away first. There were 6 of them, as Mrs. Albrecht had promised. Nadia's husband, Tom, was an architect with kind eyes and the comfortable manner of a man who had long ago made peace with being the most relaxed person in any given room. He shook Maeve's hand warmly and said, "So, you're the one who's finally cracked him," as though Callum were safe and Maeve a particularly gifted thief. Declan, Nadia's university friend, the one whose date Maeve had originally been mistaken for, arrived at 6:58 with a bottle of wine in each hand and the energy of a golden retriever at a park. His actual date, a softly sardonic woman named Fiona, who worked in architecture with Tom, arrived 30 seconds later with the air of someone who had learned to manage Declan the way you manage a large and enthusiastic weather system. And then there was Callum's mother. Eleanor Ashford arrived last, kissed Nadia on both cheeks, kissed Tom on one, looked at Declan with fond exasperation, and then turned to Maeve with the slow, thorough attention of a woman who had spent 50 years reading rooms for a living. "You must be Callum's," she started. "Maeve," Callum said from across the table. "Her name is Maeve." Eleanor looked at her son. Then she looked at Maeve. Then she smiled, and it was the most complicated smile Maeve had ever received, layered like geological strata, full of history and private knowledge and something that might have been relief. Maeve, she was discovering, was that lying required a great deal of very fast thinking. Not about the lie itself, that was the easy part, or at least the consistent part. Yes, we met recently. No, nothing dramatic, just one of those things. The hard part was the texture around the lie, the small navigational decisions. Whether to touch his arm when you leaned over to reach the salt, whether to laugh at the right volume, whether to look at him the way a person looked at someone they chose, specifically and deliberately, above all other people. That last one, she found, required no performance at all, which was information she chose for the moment not to examine. What she hadn't anticipated was that he would be good at it. Not warm exactly. He didn't become a different person over the course of the evening. He remained precise, dry, quietly authoritative in the way of someone who had spent years in rooms where he was the most knowledgeable and had stopped finding it interesting. But he was present in a way she suspected he usually wasn't. He listened when she spoke. He redirected conversations that cornered her. Once, when Declan asked a question about how they'd met that had the potential to unravel everything, Callum said with perfect calm, "She was delivering something. I opened the door. It went from there," which was technically accurate that Maeve had to take a long sip of wine to cover her expression. "That's very you," Nadia said to her brother with enormous affection. "Zero romance." "It was romantic," Maeve said before she could stop herself. Everyone looked at her. Callum looked at her. "The light," she continued, committed now, sailing off the cliff with full canvas. "The light was late afternoon. The garden. It was," she gestured vaguely. "You had to be there." "I was there," Callum said, and something in his voice had shifted a fraction of a degree, something careful and private and directed entirely at her. Nadia made a small strangled sound that she converted impressively into a cough. After dinner, Fiona joined Eleanor on the settee with the easy intimacy of someone who had attended enough of these dinners to have claimed her corner. Nadia appeared at Maeve's elbow in the way of someone who had been waiting for exactly this gap. "Walk with me," she said, which was not a question. The hallway was cooler than the dining room, lined with framed photographs that Maeve catalogued as she walked. Nadia at various ages, recognizable across decades by the quality of her energy. A much younger Eleanor at what appeared to be a garden party. A boy, grave, dark-haired, standing slightly apart from the group in every single photograph. Not happy exactly, but separate in the particular way of people whose inner life is too large for their surroundings. "He was 9 in that one," Nadia said, following her gaze. "Our father had just started the company. Callum was already building things. Software, circuits, whatever he could get his hands on. Dad thought it was brilliant. Mom thought he needed friends." She paused. "He did need friends. He just also needed to build things." "He seems," Maeve started. "Difficult," Nadia smiled. "He is. He's also the most loyal person I have ever met in my life. He flew to Edinburgh at 2 in the morning when my appendix burst. Didn't call first, just arrived. That's Callum. He doesn't talk to people, not really. He answers questions, he makes decisions, he manages things. But talking, the actual kind, where you say something true, he doesn't do that." Maeve was quiet. "He talked tonight," Nadia said, "more than I have heard him talk in a dinner in, I don't know, a long time." The guilt arrived then, properly, with its luggage. Maeve pressed her thumbnail into her. Nadia said, "You offered her a corporate account. For Callum, that is sonnets." She found him in the library. She had been looking for her coat and taken a wrong turn. A recurring theme she was beginning to understand, where this house was concerned. Pushed open a door expecting a cupboard and found instead a room that went considerably further back than the house had any right to contain. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, a fireplace doing serious committed work in the far corner, Callum sitting in a leather chair beside it with a book open across his knee that he wasn't reading. He looked up. "Lost?" he said. "Always," she said, and came in. She sat in the chair across from his, the matching one, positioned like a conversation waiting to happen. And for a moment, neither of them spoke. The fire said everything that needed saying about warmth and proximity. "Your sister knows," Maeve said. A pause. "I know she knows." "You knew she knew and you didn't?" "It would have embarrassed you," he said simply, as if this was obvious, as if the embarrassment of a woman he'd met 4 hours ago was something he'd been factoring into his decisions all evening. Maeve looked at him. "Why did you say it? She's mine. You could have just let me explain." The fire moved. Outside, distantly, she could hear Declan making his case about load-bearing walls. "You talk to me like a normal person," Callum said. She waited. "Not a function, not a name on a company. You stood in my garden and said what would happen if I did stay. And you looked at me like the answer mattered, but not in the way people usually mean. Not for what I could do or what I represented. Just whether I was worth an evening." Yes sat in her throat like a kept secret. "I'm not sure I made a good case," he said. And there it was. The driest possible humor tucked into the corner of the sentence like a folded note. The dinner was adequate, but Mrs. Albrecht oversalted the risotto, and Declan is objectively exhausting. "I thought the risotto was lovely," Maeve said, "and Declan grows on you." "He has been growing on me for 11 years. I remain unconvinced the process has an end point." She laughed, a real one, the involuntary kind, and watched something in his face do what she was beginning to recognize as his version of a smile. Not a movement of the mouth so much as a settling, a loosening of the careful arrangements he kept. She left at 11. Priya had texted from her phone, delivered, bride happy, van parked, you owe me significantly. And Mrs. Albrecht had pressed a small container of leftover shortbread into her hands without ceremony, and Nadia had hugged her with the full body commitment of someone investing in a future friendship. And Eleanor had taken her hand and said simply, "Come back," which was the kind of sentence that arrived with weight and stayed. Callum walked her to the drive. The night was cold and clearless, October doing its finest work, and the oak trees were black shapes against a sky full of more stars than she usually remembered existed. Her van sat where she'd left it that afternoon, which now felt like a different chapter of her life. "The account details," he said, and handed her a card, a different one from the first, handwritten on the back. "My personal number, for coordinating deliveries." "For coordinating deliveries?" she repeated. "Yes. Not for anything else?" He looked at her steadily. "That is entirely at your discretion." She turned the card over in her fingers. Callum Ashford, it said on the front, in the spare typography of serious money. Ashford Technologies. She turned it back to the handwritten side, where 7 digits waited in a precise architectural hand. "I do need to apologize properly," she said, "for the deception. I genuinely didn't intend." Maeve. Her name in his mouth was a different thing than it was anywhere else. She noticed this and filed it away with the other things she was not yet ready to examine in full light. "You delivered flowers to the wrong address. You stayed for dinner. You were..." Another of those careful pauses, each word weighed before placement. The best part of a difficult month. She stood in the cold driveway of a house she'd arrived at by mistake, holding a business card with a personal number on the back, and thought about all the wrong turns that had led to this precise and improbable moment. "Same time next week?" she said. Something moved across his face, that almost smile, the settled, loosened thing. "I'll tell Mrs. Albrecht." Bloom and Carry Florals, Maeve's shop, 3 streets off the high road, window displays that smelt of green things and possibility, received its first Ashford Technologies invoice the following Monday, 40 arrangements, quarterly as promised. The note attached said only, "For the peonies," and everything after. She put it in the drawer beneath the register, next to her scissors and her best grafting tape, and the things she kept close because they were useful, and the things she kept close because they mattered. It took her until Tuesday to understand there was no longer any difference between those 2 categories. She went back the following Saturday. Not to deliver flowers. He hadn't ordered any, and she hadn't pretended otherwise. She went because the card was in her pocket and the number was in her phone, and she had spent 5 days talking herself out of it before deciding on the 6th morning, while conditioning stems at 4 a.m. with her hands green to the wrist and her hair escaping its braid in 7 places, that some wrong turns were the truest direction she'd ever taken. The gate opened automatically, as before. The Oaks watched her pass, as before. The door opened before she reached it. Callum stood in the frame with a coffee mug in one hand and the expression of someone who had been listening for the specific sound of a white transit van on a private gravel drive. "You're early," he said. "I know," Maeve said. She walked in. The end, or rather the beginning, which is what all good wrong turns turn out to be.